Hello everybody. This video is going to be a little bit weird. This is mostly just a bunch of unscripted thoughts about the latest video that I did on Elden Ring, the boss critique one. Full disclosure, it's going to be super casual. I am not going to edit this, barely, if at all. I'm not in my usual recording space, so the mic quality is pretty trash. And it's also 1 in the morning, so I'm trying to not be super loud, so I don't even know how well my voice is being picked up. But basically, I'm just letting the mic run while I think aloud about some extended thoughts on a few fights that there were some things that I wanted to talk about, but I couldn't find a way to really fit into the video because either they didn't feel super important or they just didn't really fit with what I was talking about for the rest of the boss or whatever. That also includes an entire section on Godskin Duo that was ultimately cut. I fully wrote it, but I didn't include it. But since I put the work in to do the writing, I kind of just want to get it out there. Anyway, it's not a very long section, and I'll talk about why I decided to exclude it. I'll talk about why I decided to not include it. So there's that, and I also want to talk a little bit about the excuse me, of the making of the video itself, mostly just because I like documenting takeaways that I have from things if possible, kind of like what I did with the I used to make on this channel. I used to make some like Godot learning / dev diaries when I was like studying games development a little bit. I still really like using Godot, but I stopped making those videos because I got a little bored of it. But yeah, it's just gonna be like that, just some super scrappy, low energy ramblings about some Elden Ring boss stuff. So yeah, it's basically just an extension of that main video I did. If you found this video and you haven't watched the main video yet, you should probably go watch the main video first, because most things that I talk about here aren't going to make sense without it. But I feel like anyone that happens to watch this will have watched that video already, so I don't know, that was probably a pointless warning. Anyway, first things first, I'm going to quickly just read off the script that I wrote for Godskin Duo that was not included, and then I'll talk a little bit about it. I'll talk a little bit about that section afterwards. So anyway, Godskin Duo Section. This is the script that was ultimately cut from the video. Lots of what I talked about with the Valiant Gargoyles and Commander Nile can also be applied to Godskin Duo, so I don't have much to say here, but including it almost feels like a formality since it's yet another fight that's garnered tons of criticism. And rightfully so, in my opinion. I've never found these guys that hard, but they still aren't interesting, and it's frankly hard to justify their existence in the game at all. You fight Godskin Nobles and Godskin Apostles very frequently throughout the game. By my count, there's 3 of each who have their own 1v1s. Godskin Noble is in the Volcano Manor and on the way to Liurnia Divine Tower. Godskin Apostle is in the Windmill Village and at the bottom of Caelid's Tower. Then both appear consecutively in a small mountaintops dungeon, and finally we have their infamous gang fight in Crumbling Farum Azula. Their solo fights are pretty easy to come across naturally since they're usually found at relatively major points of interest, so by the time the Godskin Duo rolls around, it's pretty easy to be sick of them. They feel like a very pitiful callback to Ornstein and Smough, just without anything that made that fight good. The Godskins don't have the same choreography that ONS did, nor does their AI feel properly adjusted to fight in a pair. The reason I've never struggled with the fight much is because it's easy to keep them separated. The Noble can be dragged away from Apostle, and for the most part, they don't really interfere with each other. Excuse me. That still doesn't make it a good gank fight, though, because fighting them simultaneously isn't really justified. Sorry, that doesn't make it a good gank fight though, because then fighting them simultaneously isn't really justified, plus spending time to keep them separated is pretty tedious. If you want to try fighting them at the same time, you can, but good luck, because their movesets don't sync up at all. Godskin Noble is one of the worst in the game when it comes to attacking too frequently, which doesn't really help when he's paired up with the Apostle. It's possible that the fight is here to make you experiment with all of your tools. Afflicting sleep on one of them is apparently very effective, and since it's a 2-on-1, maybe you're being encouraged more directly to use Spirit Ashes and make it a 2v2. You can also exploit the environment, which isn't found in many other fights. The pillars are helpful for blocking their fireballs or the noble's roll. Personally, I think it's a little late for the game to pull out those stops, and it doesn't make things much more engaging. There's just no flow to any of the gank fights, and Godskin Duo is no exception. Too much time is spent gaming the AI, and it's not like the game was lacking in Godskin fights before this. Very unremarkable, very tedious. I don't think I need to spend more time talking about its problems. The best excuse I can conjure up for their existence excuse me, is that it inflates the endgame boss rush to make it seem more daunting, which frankly isn't a very good justification. And that's that. That is the Godskin Duo section. So like I mentioned, it's pretty short, and that was part of what factored in when deciding to cut it. The thing is, like, this section, I would have included this. I like including the bosses chronologically as possible, which is difficult since the game is so non-linear. But basically, Godskin Duo would have come between... excuse me. Well, my throat's very dry, I'm sorry. Godskin Duo would have come between Melania and Fortissax, I believe. Both of which are a lot more noteworthy fights compared to Duo, so just throwing it in there felt a little awkward. And more importantly than that, I don't think there was anything in there that was super interesting or worthwhile talking about that wasn't already included in the other gang fights. Like with Valiant Gargoyles, kind of the whole main point was that those two enemies don't really work well with each other, and the exact same thing is true with Godskin Duo, so like, is it really worth including again? The only two things that I could think of that were, that could have been, I guess, decently interesting to talk about is, one, why do they exist at all? Like, the best reason that I could come up with, and I think I mentioned this in the script, is that it does kind of, it pads the endgame. It pads the prospective difficulty of the endgame. Is that a word? I don't actually know. But it makes the endgame seem harder than it is because you have to go through like so many bosses. You know, it kind of adds to the pile of bosses that you face towards the end. Like, you would have Godskin Duo, and then you have to go through, you know, Malekith and Godfrey and all of that. So it just makes it seem harder, which to me isn't a very good reason for. It's not a very good way to make things seem more difficult because the fight itself is boring, but anyway. The other thing that might have been worth talking about was how they use the environment, because in all of the fights with Godskin Noble, one way to avoid his roll attack is to like use the environment. Like, I know in Volcano Manor there's a bunch of pillars that you can hide behind when he's like rolling towards you. And that's true here too, and that's using the environment to dodge attacks, which is like kind of cool. But I don't know if it wasn't really worth including an entire section on one boss just to mention, especially since I can't actually think of any other boss where the game does environmental dodging like that. Excuse me, environmental dodging like that. So I cut it. I thought it was boring, it was short, it was lame, it didn't really add much value to the rest of the video. Moving on from that, I want to really quickly go over some extended thoughts on a handful of bosses and the things that I said about them, or things that I kind of wish I did differently. Because there are a handful that, as I was going back and as I was going back and editing them mostly, I started to question some decisions I made, and ultimately I think it turned out Ultimately I think it turned out fine. But I just want to quickly mention and elaborate a little bit on a few thoughts that I had on certain bosses. The first one is Radahn. The Radahn section ended up being pretty short, and what I kind of wish I did with it was try fighting him more on foot than I did to see how the fight does that way. Because pretty much every fight that I did with Radahn eventually turned into using Torrent for at least some attacks to dodge them, or trying to fight on foot and just getting a bit frustrated for whatever reason and stopping. Because I think if that section is pretty largely just about Torrent, which on one hand, like, it makes sense for it to be like that because Radahn really he's not very subtle about it. He really wants you to use Torrent. Like, when you start the fight, there's this huge gap between you and him, and he's on a horse, and it's pretty clear that you can use Torrent to close the distance and whatever. So, like, it just seems like it makes sense to use Torrent, and the game makes it seem like it wants you to use Torrent. So I pretty much always have. But I think that if I did try fighting him on foot a little bit more, I might be able to find more things to like, because that section, again, it mostly just talked about what fighting him was like on Torrent, and it speaks a lot to how crappy Torrent is, but I think it ignores, like, the boss itself a little bit too much. Now, in fairness, if Radahn is built around using Torrent, then I think talking about Torrent's controls is fair, but not everything about him is around Torrent, and talking about those aspects a little bit more might have been valuable. For instance, even when you're on foot, a lot of his, like, longer and, like, crazier melee combos can still be dodged with rolling, and it's fun to do that. Like, those attacks feel well adjusted. For example, his I don't think there's actually 4 hits that come out during it, but it looks like kind of a 4-hit sequence where he kind of, like, he hits you a few times and he, like, spins around, does a weird spin around at the end that you have to dodge through. I don't know the name, if there's a name for that combo, but I don't know, maybe you'll know what I'm talking about. Like, that attack is easy to dodge through. I think in phase 2, when he does his yell and, like, stuns you and tries to pull you in before the rocks fly at you, I think you can iframe that. So, you know, again, can be feasibly dodged on foot, and it seems like it's pretty fun to do that, and so on. Like, the boss itself was probably a bit better than I gave it credit for, simply because I didn't experiment as much as I wish I did with fighting him completely without Torrent. And Radahn is definitely deserving of, you know, that kind of experimentation. Like, in many ways, he feels like the game he feels like the game's signature boss. So it feels right to give him the attention that he deserves, but you know, it is what it is. I still like stand by the things that I talked about in that section, mostly Torrent being horrible, because God, I hate Torrent so much. He's awful. But there's probably more that could have been said. So I wanted to quickly mention that. There's also something with Lichdragon Fortissax that I want to... It's mostly an observation that I made while working on that section, and it made me feel a bit weird about one of the main criticisms that I laid on the boss. But ultimately, in the end, I still stand by what I said. But it's something that I think people might raise eyebrows at, because I did while I was editing, and I want to, I guess, address that quickly for my own sanity. One of the main things that I talk about with Fortissax is the how there's too much going on visually. Like, you have the red lightning, you have the Deathblight pools, and the environment's very dark, and Fortissax is very dark, so it's just hard to kind of tell what's going on. I felt that for all of my playthroughs, but the thing that makes that tricky is that seems like something that's a bit silly to talk about when you're watching the fight on video instead of playing it. Because as I was going in to like edit that section, I was looking at my footage for the fight, and I said to myself, like, is that really fair what I'm saying? Because when I'm watching it in the video, like, I can kind of see everything just fine. Like, I can tell what the boss is doing. It doesn't, the contrast looks fine, especially for the lightning. Like, you know, I guess maybe there was quite a few special effects, but it doesn't look like much to distract from the fight. So I did start doubting it a little bit, but eventually I started feeling better including it, because really all it is like there's a big difference between watching the fight and actually playing it. Because when you're watching it, you can just naturally put a lot more attention, a lot more of your focus on the visual details, because you don't have to process, like, oh, what is the boss doing? What do I have to do to dodge it? And blah, blah, blah. You're just looking at the fight, so it just seems like it makes a lot more sense. But, you know, when you're actually playing, there's a lot more that you have to deal with. You have to learn how to work around all of the visual effects that he's throwing at you. So it's a matter of, like, when you're just looking at the fight on video makes it look easy. When actually playing it is a lot more overwhelming. That's basically how I ultimately started feeling about it. So it does actually kind of seem like a bit of a silly criticism. Like, I can understandably see people, like, raising eyebrows at it. But because I did too. But the more I thought about it, the more I think it's a little bit justified. Because, like, fighting Fortissax, there's so much going on, and it makes it a little bit hard to enjoy, in my opinion. Last boss that I have actually some more conflicted feelings on, just not really for the same reasons, is Morgott. Part of me kind of wonders if Morgott is as good of a boss as I made him out to be. Because the more that I think about Morgott and the more I fought Morgott, the more I started feeling like, man, he has the same problems as all of the other over-aggressive fights. And, like, I did obviously kind of address this in the video, saying with him it's a little bit more fun because his damage isn't very high, so you can just kind of hit trade with him. And it's a pretty easy fight that way. He just doesn't pose a very huge threat on his own. And I think I was willing to forgive that because the presentation of the fight is, like, so good. It's the best it's close to the best in the game, in my opinion, maybe even the best. Like, I love the setting. I love how flashy his attacks look. I love the voice acting for that entire fight. Like, his lines, both in the cutscene and, like, in the phase transition, they're all delivered so well. And that was, like, a huge positive for the fight, the whole theme and presentation of it. So I guess it makes it a little bit easier to forgive the mechanical problems, but as you play the game more, those mechanical problems start to really show themselves, and the whole atmosphere, presentation, story aspect of it starts to kind of fade away because you don't care about that stuff as much on subsequent playthroughs, right? So even though I ultimately said Morgott is, like, a pretty solid fight, especially considering he's in the end game where stuff starts to plummet, I do think he's decent, but I feel like if I think about him more, I'm going to start teetering onto the edge of, like, he's actually not wonderful. If it's a fight that's meant to be carried by, like, spectacle and presentation, then that's fine on its own, but the game leans on that an awful lot, so, you know, again, that's something else that I am just kind of rehashing from the video. But yeah, like, Morgott, I honestly, the more I think about him, the more I start to not like him. Like, the main attacks to me are, like, his crazy, you know, DMC, wombo combo, spin attack, giant thing, the 12 or 13 hitbox combo. Like, that move is just ridiculous. And also his, like, regular, like, the move that's reused from Margit, where he does his, like, 4-hit spin. That one also doesn't feel great. the main thing I think is like if you don't get the initial dodge right on that one, like you're going to probably end up taking more hits, because like the timing's kind of getting the other timings right depends on when you start out, so it's just a little bit awkward. So I like Morgott for the character, but for the gameplay, it might be, I kind of wish I was a little more harsh on it, because he has a bunch of the combo and over-aggression issues that other bosses do. So yeah, Morgott, Radahn, and Fortissax are kind of the three main bosses that I wanted to ramble on a little bit. Morgott kind of leads into the next thing I wanted to mention, that I kind of realized as I was writing this video that even though I don't like the bosses in Elden Ring, I really don't, but I actually ended up coming off as a lot more positive than I really am, which sounds stupid, because ultimately the video is the tone is pretty negative, but even for bosses that I don't really like a whole lot, there were still some like good things said about them. Like Estelle, for example, talking about the sound cue thing. Like that's a cool implementation, and it makes the boss seem a bit cooler. Even though like honestly, Estelle he's not amazing, but I tried to focus on the more unique, interesting to talk about things. What kind of made it really click with me is what kind of made me really, really realize this, I should say, is that a big thing with Elden Ring is that the quality of the end game is really subpar compared to the rest of the game, and that includes with boss fights. Like, I don't like the end game bosses, but if we actually take a step back and break those end game bosses down, let's see what we end up with. The bosses that I consider like, super endgame are the ones in like Halig Tree and Crumbling Farm Azula and beyond. So that would include Loretta, Melania, Godskin Duo, Fortissax, Malekith, Godfrey, and Radahn. I feel like there might be one that I'm forgetting. I guess Gideon Ofnir kind of counts in that too, but yeah, he's very minor. I'm not gonna think about him. But yeah, like among those bosses, Loretta and Fortissax, I spoke very highly of. Godfrey and Radahn were also good. They just had some, they had their problems, but they were decent. And then Godskin Duo, which is a pretty awful fight, wasn't included in the video at all. So with the bosses that I had nothing good to say about, that leaves us with Malekith and Melania. And if I'm trying to say that the endgame of Elden Ring isn't very good with its boss fights, well, that doesn't really come off that way when only 2 of like the 7 or 8 of the endgame bosses are like truly terrible, So basically, like, even though, for most critiques you wouldn't really expect this, but I actually might have come off as more positive than I really am. And what I think a lot of that comes from is actually the fact that many bosses that I and others consider like the absolute worst in the game were just straight up not included. Like, for example, if we're looking for other enemies that are way too aggressive and attack way too frequently, I think Elamir of the Briar is a great example of that, and Godskin Noble is also a very good example of that. But neither of them were ultimately included because they're not really major bosses. I mean, you could make the argument, since they give you achievements, like, yeah, it might have been worth including them, but I don't know, it felt like they distracted from the more important fights, so I decided not to. And a lot of those fights too, like, you would just be saying the same thing about what makes them bad, they attack too much and they're too aggressive, whatever. So I don't know, it was a weird thing that I didn't feel great about, that came up while editing, or while writing and while editing when I was in like the final stages. I ended up sounding like I liked more of the fights than I actually do, I should say. So, you know, I guess part of it is I do try to find the silver lining in a lot of things, because I think that can be valuable and whatever. But I think if I could still adjust the script a little bit, I would actually be I would be a little bit more harsh in some places. Like I said, with Morgott, even with Godfrey, like so many people seem to love Godfrey, and I get it, but I'm so conflicted on him. Like, he honestly doesn't feel like a wonderful boss to me the more I fight him, and I tried to convey that uncertainty in the video a little bit, which I think I was. I think that section turned out alright. I think I was kind of able to do it. But, like, you know, Godfrey, I made sure to say that he was decent and he's not unfair and whatever. But I don't really know if he is. Like, I could be convinced that what I said about him wasn't actually true if I just think about it more. So yeah, I don't know. Some of them were just a little. I probably should have been a bit more privy to some of their flaws. I don't know if you can tell, but it's getting late and I'm starting to lose my mind, or not lose my mind. I'm a little brain is a little foggy, so this is just getting very rambly, but whatever. That's kind of the whole point of the video. Actually, I think regarding the bosses themselves, that's kind of the last thing that I wanted to say. I just want to dedicate a little bit of time to talking more about the video, the making of the video itself, because this was a very hard video to make, a lot harder than I expected, but I had quite a few takeaways from it, and I think that's valuable to address, and I guess to have documented in case I'm ever looking back on my own stuff. I don't know. I don't have anything else. I don't know if anyone's gonna watch this far. I don't have anything else to say on like the bosses themselves. So if that's all you're interested in hearing about, you don't have to watch any further. But thank you for watching this far. If either way, if you actually did. So yeah, as for the making of this video, there were quite a few roadblocks that made it difficult. First, actually deciding what to include. I agonized over that probably longer than I needed to. It was interesting. The initial list, I don't remember if I made a post about this. I'll just repeat it if I did. It's fine. The initial list was very long. It was every boss that gave an achievement, and then I added some extra ones that were still relatively significant, like Falling Star Beast, Gideon Ofnir, and the Deathbirds, and things like that. A lot of this stuff still felt important, so I wanted to at least talk about them, but then I ended up with a list of like 35 or 40 bosses, and that was just overwhelming, and a lot of it wouldn't make for an interesting video. So as I was trimming stuff, I had a hard time deciding what to include. And so I ran a poll that kind of, I ran a poll that helped narrow it down and everything. And really the key thing that I realized is that it's probably only worth talking about things that actually add value to the video. One of the things that I think if I was trying to make the videos actually interesting is to just try to cut out as much unnecessary stuff as possible and only include things that bring value to the broader discussion or the video thesis or whatever. So after realizing that, I realized, well, I'll go back to this example. If I'm including both Elemer of the Briar and Godskin Noble, well, both of them have the problem of attacking too frequently. So is it really worth including both of them to make what is essentially the same point? Probably not, right? And then I ultimately ended up cutting both of them because, attacking too much could be displayed by Morgott and Beast Clergyman and Godfrey to an extent, and stuff like that. So I felt a little bit better about cutting them at that point. And then, the poll helped me. the poll that I ran helped me realize that I only really need to include like it's okay to like include just a narrow few things. You can still get a lot of there's still a lot to say about just like the remembrance bosses and then a few extras, which is ultimately what I went with. So I guess like kind of the big thing there is to trim the fat where possible. I think having a more narrow focus can be beneficial a lot of the time. And I initially I kind of lost sight of that when I was, planning for the video and wanting to include like as much as possible. So ultimately I'm glad the list of chosen bosses turned out the way that it did. I think it was pretty solid. That ended up just being the beginning of like problems with making that video though, because like I mentioned, it turned out to be really hard, and the main reason for that, I think it was my own fault. It was I didn't work on this video the same way that I did for everything else that I've done. The way that I've done pretty much it's not like I've made a ton of videos before this, so obviously I'm not drawing from a whole lot of experience. I'm definitely aware of that. But for every other video that I've made before that one, I would kind of do everything in like a waterfall sequence. So like I would get all of the footage from whatever playthroughs I needed to do, and then I would write the entire script before moving on, and then I would record all of the audio before moving on, and then I would edit all of the audio before moving on, and whatever. That's not a horrible way to do it, but it feels a little bit, rigid and strict in what's possible. And so I started thinking like, well, maybe if I just try doing a lot of things concurrently and try being a little bit more flexible with production, since this video format also kind of allows for that, maybe I should just try, after I fight a boss, I'll write the script immediately and, sit on it for a while, and then, I'll go fight the next few bosses in game, and like maybe I'll write the script for those, or maybe I'll tinker the old one or whatever. I could just kind of do things in whatever order I wanted. And the idea is that allowing more freedom during that process would one, be more fun, and two, help things get done a little bit quicker, since nothing would there weren't necessarily as many, I guess, bottlenecks in production. Like, before, if I wanted to start recording audio, I would wait until the entire script was done, and if the script was taking a long time, then that would delay the time that I had to record the audio for it, right? But in reality, what ended up happening was I just got super disorganized, and that kind of freedom that I was expecting ended up just being it ended up not helping very much, because basically what would happen is let's say for example, one of the earliest scripts that I wrote for that video was for Renala, because it was just fresh in my mind at some point, and I wanted to write it, so I did. So I wrote the Renala script very early on, before I had even gone on to like even capturing footage for anything beyond like Kaled, or maybe I was up to Altus at that point, I don't really remember. But, I wrote Renala very early, and I'm like, okay, cool, that's a good section. Now let's just leave it there and move on to the rest of the game. Then I went on and I fought Radahn and I fought Morgott and whatever. I progressed quite far, and then by the time I was coming back to like review the script again, I had just straight up forgotten a lot of my thoughts on Renala, and then I had to like reread them and kind of remember what I was wanting to talk about, and just like it felt weird kind of jumping back and forth between all of that. It's a little bit hard to explain. But yeah, like it didn't feel right, and it felt very unclean. The other part of it that made it hard is like it's mostly a technical thing, like excuse me, like since there were so many fights included, but a lot of the recordings were shorter, just kind of shorter, like 10 to 20 minute clips of me fighting a boss. organizing the actual like recordings for the whole thing excuse me, for the whole thing was quite difficult. So that was just kind of the best way I can describe it is disorganized. I don't think I explained those problems very well, but whatever. I hope the idea is getting conveyed. When I did things without that kind of, without that sort of more careful process, I would just confuse myself, or I would overwhelm myself, or I would go back and look at things that I didn't really agree with anymore, but I couldn't be sure, and things like that. The other thing that made it annoying was there ended up being a lot of fights that I didn't capture enough footage for, so I had to like replay a decent portion of the game to get back to them. Namely, I did not have nearly enough footage that I needed for Malekith, and Malekith is near the end of the game. So I had to I booted up one of my save files, and it was the strength one, because this is getting off topic, but like the save files that I used for this video already had a bit of progress in them, because I had started them previously just off without thinking about a video, and I just forgot about them, but I just went back to them because I already had some progress, blah blah blah. So I had to play all the way back up to Malekith on the strength run, so I could get more footage and this and that. So basically, yeah, I was just all over the place, and unfocused a lot of the time. And obviously part of that could probably be attributed to the video format, the fact that you kind of have the sections don't necessarily have to relate to each other in this video. I can talk about Margit, and then everything about Margit is isolated to the Margit section, and then everything about Godric is isolated to the Godric section. So if I wanted to do things concurrently, it was fine. I didn't need to rely on any past work to or I didn't need to rely on any past sections to write future sections. And that is a benefit of that format for sure. But if you're not careful, a lot of that will just kind of get jumbled in your head. And when you're talking about one boss, you might just end up accidentally repeating everything you said in another boss, because you get into the mindset of, oh well, I can talk about sort of whatever I want here, because this is one section and the other boss is another section, and things like that. So I still think there is still some value definitely in doing that concurrent approach. One thing that I think is nice is not doing recording the audio all in one sitting, because this might sound silly to some people, because it kind of is, but I have a hard time recording audio for super long stretches, just because of the way my setup works and everything. And I don't want the quality of the voiceover to suffer for it, because I want to have good voiceovers. Mine aren't very good, I don't think. The mic quality is not great. I don't have a great narrating voice, whatever. I mean, I'm working on it, obviously, but I don't want to just tire myself out doing spending an entire day recording 20 pages of script. I don't like doing that. So being able to record some parts of a script that are written, and just getting bits and pieces done over a longer period instead of doing it all in one short burst, that can be helpful. I still need to find a balance of what the hell am I saying? I need to strike a balance between finding getting a decent amount done versus getting too tired. There, that makes sense. So that's one thing. The other benefit is I think what I'm gonna try to do more actively is write the script soon after playing part of a game and recording part of a game, since it's very as soon as you close a game, it's much more fresh in your memory, and it is helpful to, you know, sit on some thoughts for a while to see how you really feel about them. But at least like just getting some thoughts down might end up just morphing into like a well-written a well-written script. And you know, I think some of the better things that I've written on videos before, some of the things that I'm more proud of, I think I did that when thoughts of the game were still very fresh in my memory, and you know, writing as I was formulating opinions on certain things. I think that turns out pretty good, and in a way that is concurrent because you're writing a script before you're done capturing all of the footage and taking all of your notes and things like that. So I would like to experiment around with that a little bit more, because I think that can be, it can lead to better quality writing. That's what I've noticed. So I do want to try that a little bit more. But otherwise, like, I need to learn how to stay organized better, because you know, this video taught me that if you don't do things, this video. What am I saying again? This video taught me that, you know, I probably work best doing things more in that waterfall fashion, and just doing a few things in a more non-linear, concurrent manner, if possible, but not trying to force it and go all in with that approach. I don't know, I guess from like, you know, a software development perspective, because that's what I study in school, so I just think about it like this. It's a matter of like waterfall versus agile in a sense. There are a few, in terms of like efficiency and workflows, I guess there's a few parallels there. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to go over. This is already 40 minutes, holy crap. I think that's about everything. Yeah, I think that's about everything. Long story short, it was a hard video to make. I'm still satisfied with the end product, but, you know, as I mentioned, I wanted to talk about a few extra things there. So yeah, if you happen to watch this far, then thank you so much. I don't know how entertaining this was. I can't imagine it was that great, but as always, if you have any thoughts, feel free to drop them below. I always like hearing them. If you happen to make videos yourself, actually, it'd be cool to hear what your kind of process is like. I always I kind of like just trying to make things, not just for like video making, for anything really. I like trying to like find efficiencies and you know, learn how to do things a little bit faster and whatnot. It's kind of a part of getting better at your craft, so to speak. I enjoy that element quite a bit. So if you make videos yourself or anything creative, really, it'd be cool to hear about what your process is like. I think those could be some pretty interesting discussions to have. Anyway, yeah, that about does it. Thank you very much again for watching this far. It is late, and this ran a lot longer than I expected, so I think I'm just gonna go to bed now. But yeah, thanks everybody. Thank you for the continued support on the main videos. I don't say this a whole lot, but it's always very, very appreciated. And yeah, I think that about does it for me. Bye-bye.